The wind carried an uneasy silence across the Sacramento Valley in 1846. Campfires flickered beneath an orange sky, their smoke curling above the trees like whispers of warning. In the nearby village, the Wintu people gathered in quiet dread, sensing that something unnatural was approaching. Their children clung to mothers, eyes reflecting the firelight and fear. Beyond the hills, John C. Fremont and his armed men moved with purpose, rifles gleaming, orders whispered, "No mercy!" Before dawn, gunfire erupted. The river ran red as shouts turned to cries. Over 100 Wintu men, women, and children fell that morning along the Sacramento River, their songs drowned in the thunder of muskets. It would be remembered as the Sacramento River Massacre, the moment when the air itself began to taste like sorrow and betrayal. Quick pause before we continue. Please tell us in the world are you watching from. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and don't forget to like and share. By 1851, California's first elected governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, stood before the state legislature. His voice was cold, deliberate. A war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. The chamber was silent, but the words struck like gunshots. Behind polished desks, lawmakers nodded in grim agreement, sealing the fate of thousands. Outside those walls, the Yuki, Pomo, Maidu, and Miwok families worked the soil under threat of the lash. What Burnett called policy became the daily reality of starvation, forced marches, and raids. For the indigenous peoples of California, the governor's decree wasn't politics. It was a death sentence, written in ink, but carried out in blood. The year was 1850, and the California legislature passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Its name sounded civil, but its purpose was cruel. Under this law, any native child could be apprenticed to a white settler. In truth, it legalized kidnapping and slavery. Women and children were sold for labor, traded for tobacco, or forced into servitude under the guise of protection. Courtrooms denied natives the right to testify against whites, silencing victims before they could speak. Fathers hid their daughters in forests at night, praying they wouldn't be taken by dawn. In the towns of San Jose, Sonoma, and Sacramento, indenture auctions became routine, while state militias were funded to hunt down those who resisted. Civilization had arrived, but mercy had not. In 1859, Walter S. Jarboe, a man who called himself a patriot, led the Eel River Rangers against the Yuki Nation. His official report spoke of campaigns, but the truth was massacre. Jarboe's men were paid by the state, $1 per head for every native killed, $5 for each prisoner taken. The Yuki fought back with spears and courage, defending their homeland from men with rifles and torches. Villages burned, children vanished. By the end of the Mendocino War, hundreds lay dead, and survivors were marched in chains to reservations. In Sacramento, Jarboe's reports were accepted without question. Paperwork replaced graves. Bureaucracy replaced guilt. One man tried to speak. J. Ross Brown, a federal agent sent to California, rode through the ashes of emptied villages. He recorded the horror in his reports. Women shot mid-flight, infants taken from arms, elders left to die. His writings became the first official acknowledgement of what others tried to hide. California was waging war on its own first people. Brown's words reached Washington, but few cared. Settlers grew richer, while the Pomo, Wailaki, and Nomlaki were driven into the mountains. In the evenings, Brown wrote by lamplight, knowing that truth alone could not stop the killing, but history might remember who stood silent and who tried to speak. Long before California became a state, the Spanish missions stretched like scars across the coast. The Ohlone, Miwok, and Yokuts peoples were told the missions would bring salvation, yet salvation came with chains. Father Junipero Serra's missionaries demanded labor as the price of faith. Stone churches rose on the backs of those who once roamed free. Children were baptized without consent. Families were torn apart by bells calling them to forced work. Women were locked in dormitories, protected from sin, yet abused by those claiming holiness. Disease spread through the crowded barracks, and graves multiplied faster than prayers. Behind every whitewashed wall, songs of the ancestors were silenced, and another world died. In 1848, James Marshall found gold at John Sutter's mill, and greed consumed California. Sutter's empire had already been built on kidnapped native labor. Miwok and Maidu men forced to build his fort, women used as servants, and worse. But with gold, cruelty became lawless. Miners swarmed the rivers, killing anyone who stood in their way. Bounties were placed on native scalps, $5 for a child, $25 for a man. Vigilantes scoured the valleys, and entire tribes vanished in weeks. For the Nessinan, Yokuts, and Pomo, the gold rush was not fortune but extinction. Their lands were stolen, their people enslaved, their songs buried beneath the sound of pickaxes striking the earth. From California to Oregon and Washington Territory, survivors fled, guided by whispers of safety among the Wintu, Wailaki, and Nomlaki. Mothers carried infants wrapped in deer hide, walking through snow and hunger, hunted by settlers who claimed bounties from the state. Those who reached northern refugees found little peace. In Shasta and Humboldt, militia patrols burned villages and took prisoners. Captured men were chained and marched to labor camps. Women were sold as servants to frontier homes. The promise of protection became a lie repeated by every governor and soldier. The northern forests, once alive with drums and laughter, became silent tombs of the displaced. In the Eel River Valley, 1860, soldiers surrounded a small settlement of the Wiyot tribe. It was the night of their world renewal ceremony, a sacred ritual meant to bring balance between the earth and the sky. As the tribe slept, settlers crossed the river with axes and knives. By dawn, the water ran thick with blood. More than 200 Wiyot women and children lay dead, their songs cut short. The few survivors told of cries that echoed across the bay. Newspapers called it the Indian Island Massacre. But to the Wiyot, it was the night the world fell silent. And yet, from the survivors, a vow was born. One day, their songs would rise again. Far beyond California, in the Great Plains and forests of the East, treaties were written with promises of peace. The Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole signed their names, trusting words that would betray them. In 1838, the U.S. government forced thousands on a brutal journey west, the Trail of Tears. Snow fell as mothers carried dying children, elders collapsed from exhaustion, and soldiers pressed forward. Over 4,000 Cherokee perished before reaching Oklahoma. The air froze with grief and disbelief. For the survivors, the trail never ended. It followed them in dreams, in the hollow sound of their own heartbeat, reminding them that every promise written by the government was another step into exile. By 1864, the prairies of Colorado Territory glowed beneath the rising sun. On the banks of Sand Creek, the Cheyenne and Arapaho families gathered under white flags, believing the U.S. Army had promised peace. Children played near the tents, women ground corn, and old men whispered prayers to the dawn. Then came the thunder. Colonel John Chivington and his 700 volunteers charged without warning. The air filled with screams as rifles cracked. Over 200 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered. Soldiers mutilated the dead, taking scalps as trophies. Even the horses lay silent afterward, their bodies strewn among the ashes of the innocent. Word of the Sand Creek Massacre spread like wildfire. Survivors, burned, broken, yet breathing, crawled across the plains to tell what they had seen. One mother carried her infant's lifeless body for 2 days, refusing to leave her child behind. Others spoke of soldiers laughing as they burned the lodges. When Congress investigated, the truth could not be denied. Reports described shocking atrocities committed by Chivington's men. Yet no one was punished. For the Cheyenne and Arapaho, the United States had shown its true face, one that smiled with diplomacy but killed with impunity. As the wars spread westward, tribes like the Sioux, Comanche, Apache, and Nez Perce faced new waves of soldiers and settlers. They were pushed into barren lands called reservations, where hunger replaced freedom. The buffalo herds, lifeblood of the plains, were systematically slaughtered by the millions, their carcasses left to rot, leaving entire nations to starve. To the people, it was not only the death of food, it was the death of spirit. Ceremonies once filled with drums and chants became whispers. Chiefs who resisted, like Sitting Bull and Geronimo, were branded as enemies for daring to survive. In Washington, generals spoke of civilizing the Indian. They believed that to break a people, you must first break their children. Schools were opened. Places like Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt. His motto was cruelly simple: kill the Indian, save the man. Children were taken by force from their families. Their hair was cut, their languages banned, their names replaced. The sound of their native songs vanished into silence. Letters home were censored. Punishment was swift for speaking a single word of heritage. Education became another battlefield, and identity was the casualty. December 29th, 1890. The snow at Wounded Knee Creek was red before noon. Chief Spotted Elk, Bigfoot, led a band of starving Lakota Sioux seeking peace. The U.S. 7th Cavalry surrounded their camp. A single shot was fired. Then chaos. Hotchkiss guns opened fire on the men, women, and children. In less than an hour, over 250 Lakota lay dead, half of them women and children. The U.S. soldiers received 20 medals of honor for their bravery. The frozen plains were silent except for the wind that carried the cries of the dying into history's memory. Back in California, J. Ross Brown continued to send reports of atrocities. He described the state-funded militias who claimed bounties for every native head and the massacres at Round Valley and Redwood Creek. He pleaded for federal intervention, but Washington remained silent. His journals painted vivid portraits: children crying as mothers were dragged away, rivers filled with corpses, villages razed in the name of progress. Brown's pen trembled, yet he kept writing, knowing the ink was all that could stand against the sword. In the rugged hills of Mendocino, the Yuki people faced their final battle. Walter Jarbo's men returned, this time with torches instead of rifles. Fires devoured the night sky as the Yuki fought with stones, sticks, and desperate courage. When dawn came, silence fell over the valley. Over 400 Yuki men, women, and children lay dead. The survivors were rounded up, marched barefoot to Round Valley Reservation, and left to starve. California's newspapers called it pacification. The Yuki called it what it was: genocide. Throughout the 1800s, indigenous women became targets of kidnapping and sexual slavery. In frontier towns, native girls were sold to settlers for coins or alcohol. Laws offered no protection, native testimony was banned, and their humanity erased by ink. Mothers hid their daughters in caves and forests, praying through sleepless nights. Some escaped, finding shelter among sympathetic tribes like the Pomo or Wailaki, but most never returned. Behind the false civility of Western expansion lay the quiet horror of unpunished violence. While the U.S. carried out removals and massacres, Canada built a different prison, the Indian Act of 1876. It gave the government power over every aspect of Indigenous life: movement, marriage, land, and identity. The Cree, Anishinaabe, Haida, and Inuit were pushed onto reserves, forced into dependency. Residential schools, run by church and state, tore generations apart. Children as young as 5 were taken from their parents, punished for their language, beaten for speaking truth. Across the tundra and forests, the sound of children's laughter disappeared into the cold wind. By the early 1900s, graves began to outnumber schools. Thousands of children died in residential institutions, their names erased, their stories forgotten. Survivors spoke of starvation, disease, and abuse by priests and nuns. When investigations came decades later, they uncovered mass unmarked graves across Canada and the northern United States. The land itself held their memories. Survivors now tell their stories with trembling voices, knowing they speak for those who never made it home. By 1910, the reservations had grown quiet, but beneath that silence, stories were buried. Elders whispered of the massacres that the government tried to erase. Children learned to hide their ancestry, pretending to be something else to survive. In secret, songs returned. The Pomo and Maidu began to gather under the moonlight, humming old melodies. The land still remembered their footsteps, and in the hush of the valleys, echoes of resistance began to rise. In both Canada and the United States, boarding schools filled with laughter that soon turned into sobs. The Carlisle, Calaco, and Haskell schools trained Native children to serve, not to lead. The government called it education. Survivors called it erasure. Children were whipped for speaking their mother tongue. Some never returned home. Buried behind dormitories, their graves bore no names. Teachers read scripture over them, while the families at home waited for letters that would never come. By the 1920s, new greed replaced gold, oil. In Oklahoma, the Osage Nation, suddenly wealthy from oil rights, faced a wave of murders. Over 60 tribal members were killed in what became known as the Osage Reign of Terror. White guardians, bankers, and lawmen orchestrated the killings for inheritance money. The FBI's first major case was born out of Osage blood. Justice came slowly, but the message was clear. Even wealth could not protect Native lives from the hunger of empire. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting U.S. citizenship to indigenous peoples. The announcement was celebrated in Washington, but on reservations it felt hollow. Citizenship meant little when land, language, and children had already been stolen. Voting rights were still denied in many states. The same hands that offered citizenship had taken nearly everything else. During the 1930s, hunger gripped the reservations. Federal relief rarely arrived. Families bartered beadwork for flour and dried meat. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 tried to restore tribal governance, but the damage was deep. Still, something stirred. Young leaders began to rise, voices that refused silence. They would become the next generation's fire, carrying the memory of genocide and the dream of justice. World War II came, and Native men enlisted not for the nation that betrayed them, but for honor. The Navajo code talkers, Comanche, and Cherokee soldiers crafted unbreakable codes from their own languages. Their words, once punished in schools, became the U.S. military's secret weapon. On foreign soil, they saved lives with every message, proving that no amount of oppression could erase their brilliance or loyalty. When the soldiers returned home, medals couldn't fill the emptiness. Promises of equality remained broken. Veterans who fought for freedom abroad were denied it on their own land. In the Dakotas, Lakota families returned to poverty. In California, Pomo workers labored for pennies. Yet their dignity remained untouchable, carved into the land like stone, waiting for history to finally listen. The 1950s brought a cruel idea: termination. The U.S. Mass government sought to dissolve tribes entirely, ending recognition and cutting off aid. Over 100 tribal nations were stripped of sovereignty. The policy fractured communities. Thousands left reservations for cities under the relocation program, promised opportunity but met with poverty and racism. Yet in the heart of displacement, the seeds of rebellion were sown. By the 1960s, the tide turned. Indigenous youth, tired of silence, rose in defiance. The American Indian Movement, AIM, was born. They marched, occupied, and shouted the truths buried for centuries. In 1969, activists occupied Alcatraz Island, declaring it Indian land. The world finally listened. For 19 months, the island became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that indigenous identity could not be exterminated. In 1973, Wounded Knee returned to the headlines, not as a massacre, but as a stand. AIM activists, surrounded by federal agents, took control of the small town on the Pine Ridge Reservation, demanding justice for treaty violations and corruption. For 71 days, gunfire and negotiations filled the air. The ghosts of 1890 seemed to watch. When the siege ended, 2 Native men were dead. But the world finally remembered what Wounded Knee meant, a wound that had never healed. As men fought on the front lines, Indigenous women built movements of healing and justice. Wilma Mankiller, Rigoberta Menchú, and others led with courage rooted in tradition. They stood against both colonial power and gender oppression. Through their voices, the world began to understand that colonization wasn't only about land. It was about silencing women, too. Their words brought back balance, restoring the heartbeat of nations' long-denied breath. In the 1980s, survivors of boarding schools began to speak publicly. They told of electric shocks, starvation, and sexual abuse. The world listened in horror as decades of pain surfaced. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission began to collect testimonies. In the U.S., archives revealed thousands of children who died in federal and church-run schools. The earth, when dug, revealed graves that had waited a century to be found. For many survivors, returning home meant facing ghosts. They struggled with lost languages and families that no longer knew them. Trauma became generational, passed like inheritance through silence. Yet, from that silence, art and strength emerged. Songs, poems, and stories rekindled what the government tried to erase. Pain became the soil where new voices grew. During the late 20th century, corporations began to strip native lands for profit, mining, logging, and drilling through sacred spaces. The Havasupai fought for the Grand Canyon, the Lakota defended the Black Hills. Courts often ruled against them, but the battles built solidarity. Each mountain, river, and forest became not just a place, but a memory of ancestors who had never surrendered. By the 1990s, poverty, alcoholism, and suicide plagued many reservations, symptoms of centuries of trauma. Yet the government still debated aid as though they had not caused the wounds. Despite it all, communities rebuilt. Tribal colleges opened, languages revived, and ceremonies returned. The flame was faint, but it burned, defying the darkness that history had tried to cast over it. In the 2000s, a new tragedy demanded attention: the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG. Across the U.S. and Canada, thousands vanished with little investigation or justice. Families marched with photos and candles, chanting names that authorities ignored. The 2019 Canadian inquiry named it plainly, a genocide against Indigenous women. The cycle of violence had never truly ended. It had evolved. Archaeologists and elders began to uncover unmarked graves at former residential schools. Each discovery tore open old wounds and revealed what survivors had long said. The children were buried without names. Communities held vigils, lighting fires that burned through the night. The air was filled with the smell of sage and sorrow. Across North America, the land itself became a witness, telling truths long denied. Music became resistance. From powwows to hip-hop, Indigenous artists blended the ancient with the modern. The drum beat, once banned, now thundered in stadiums and protests alike. Every beat declared survival. The rhythm said what words could not, "We are still here." For every ancestor silenced, a new generation sang louder. By 2020, truth had become a movement. Governments issued apologies, though many rang hollow. But indigenous nations no longer waited for permission to heal. Documentaries, court cases, and memorials began to rewrite the record. From the Yuki of Mendocino to the Lakota of Pine Ridge, every name once erased found its way back into history books. The young now carry the stories of their grandparents, the tears, the songs, the survival. They speak in both English and the languages once forbidden. They walk with pride, not shame. Across the continent, monuments rise not to conquerors, but to the conquered who endured. The earth still holds their blood, but also their courage. The story is not over. It is reborn in every heartbeat that remembers. The 21st century dawned with fire and remembrance. From California to Saskatchewan, communities held vigils for ancestors. Candles flickered beneath old trees where raids once began. Smoke rose again, not from destruction, but from ceremony. Every flame carried a name: a child lost at Carlisle, a mother killed at Sand Creek, a father taken by bounty hunters. The living spoke the names aloud, ensuring the dead would not vanish twice. Governments began to apologize, first in whispers, then in speeches broadcast worldwide. In 2008, Canada issued an official apology for residential schools. In 2022, the United States followed, acknowledging the crimes of forced assimilation. But survivors said apology was not enough. They wanted their land back, their languages restored, their children's graves honored. History's debts could not be paid in words alone. Archaeologists uncovered burial grounds at former schools in Kamloops, Marieville, and Carlisle. Hundreds of unmarked graves surfaced, confirming what elders had long said. The discovery tore through the world's conscience. Communities gathered in silence. Drums began to beat, slow, steady, mournful. Each strike of the drum said, "We told you, we remembered, we never forgot." An old woman named Lena, a survivor of the Shubenacadie school, sang at one of the first memorials. Her voice cracked, thin but strong. She sang in Mi'kmaq, the language beaten out of her as a child. Her song was not just for the dead. It was for the living, to remind them that survival is itself a victory. Each note carried centuries of grief, yet beneath it, hope trembled like dawn. In 2023, the remains of dozens of Native children were returned from Carlisle to their families. Processions stretched along the roads as drums led the coffins home. Flags of tribal nations waved beside tears and prayers. For the first time in generations, the children were back where they belonged. The earth received them gently, and the people sang them into peace. Across the continent, indigenous activists stood against pipelines, mining, and deforestation. The Standing Rock Sioux faced police, dogs, and water cannons to protect the Missouri River. Their chant, MMIWG, water is life, echoed across the world. Young and old stood side by side, united not by weapons, but by courage. The same courage that once carried their ancestors through exile now defended the planet itself. The internet became a new campfire. Through social media, indigenous storytellers, artists, and historians shared the truths once erased from textbooks. Youth revived their languages through apps and videos, teaching what their great-grandparents were punished for speaking. Technology, once used to silence them, now amplified their voices. History began to breathe again through screens, music, and art. On reservations, healing circles replaced the silence. Elders shared stories of horror and endurance. Children listened, not with fear but pride. Therapists, teachers, and traditional healers worked together to mend wounds that had crossed generations. Healing became not forgetting, but remembering correctly. Those who had lived through the schools made a vow. No child would suffer in silence again. Survivors formed councils and foundations to teach history in their own words. Their motto was simple. Never again means never forgotten. They taught that remembrance is a shield stronger than denial. Linguists and elders gathered in classrooms made of cedar and hope. Children spoke Ojibwe, Lakota, Yuki, and Wintu again. Each word reclaimed was a victory over centuries of oppression. The classrooms echoed with laughter and confidence, the sound of survival reborn through language. The words that once brought punishment now brought power. The forests, rivers, and mountains began to whisper again. Tribal nations reclaimed lands once stolen. Parks returned, rivers renamed, ceremonies revived. On the Yurok River, salmon returned to waters where they had vanished for decades. Nature seemed to remember its keepers, welcoming them back. Across reservations, elders began recording oral histories. Their voices carried centuries of wisdom, preserved for the unborn. "We endured because we had each other," one elder said. "Now it is your turn to carry the fire." Their words became the bridge between the ashes of the past and the light of the future. Courtrooms finally echoed with truth. Governments faced lawsuits over stolen children and unpaid treaties. Tribes began winning land claims, language rights, and reparations. Each verdict was a small resurrection, a sign that justice, though late, could still breathe. Indigenous women took their place as leaders once more. Chiefs, ministers, and judges now bore the same names once written on bounty lists. They led with empathy and strength, proving that the future belonged not to conquest, but to compassion. Art exploded, films, paintings, songs, all carrying the stories once forbidden. The world began to see Native peoples not as relics, but as innovators, scholars, and protectors. The fire that once burned villages now lit stages and classrooms. Storytelling became rebellion, and truth became art. In schools and cities, Native children now raised their heads high. They wore regalia on graduation day, danced at powwows, streamed worldwide, and corrected teachers who mispronounced their tribes. The shame once imposed had transformed into unshakable pride. They were living proof that identity can survive every attempt to erase it. At sunrise, ceremonies began across North America. Drums, chants, and tears merged into one sound, the heartbeat of nations reborn. The ancestors, it seemed, were listening. Through the smoke, people said they could almost see them, watching, smiling, whispering, "You kept our fire alive." In the same fields where massacres once stained the soil, children now played, laughing freely. Their joy was the greatest rebellion. Every shout of laughter became a hymn for those who never got to grow up. The earth no longer echoed with cries of pain, but with the sound of life continuing. From textbooks to documentaries, the true story of Native endurance entered classrooms, parliaments, and homes. No longer could anyone say, "We didn't know." Truth had become uncontainable, spreading like sunrise across generations. History was no longer written by conquerors, it was spoken by survivors. The story ends where it began, with the land. It has witnessed blood, fire, tears, and rebirth. The soil holds both the bones of the fallen and the roots of tomorrow. No empire outlives truth. No hatred silences memory. From forced labor to freedom, from massacre to revival, the story of indigenous peoples teaches that survival is the ultimate resistance. Their strength is not only in what they endured, but in what they continue to create. A living testament that even in the darkest night, the fire of identity never dies. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive.